Welcome to the Building Renaissance Leaders podcast. We build digital reference library for leaders. Here's your host, Vic Vogel.
Hello, how you doing, YouTubers, and all the people who may be joining from LinkedIn, where I've just broadcast this as much as I could on my channel over there, and also Facebook, and I think I put a link to it on Instagram also. So I want to welcome you to this evening's Building Renaissance Leaders podcast. What I'm trying to do with this series of podcasts is sort of point out um, and point out the classes that I do inside of my interpersonal communications leadership course. There are 12 classes. These are all things that I have felt were important from a communication perspective for leaders to know. But I wanted to try to give you sort of an overview of what that particular class is about for each of the 12 classes so you get some sense of what is going on in there. But I wanted to approach it from the standpoint of how important interpersonal communication, which is the underpinning of all those classes, how important that is to actually being able to execute these leadership skills. You have to think of leaders as your lifeblood to your organization. They're the veins and the blood that courses through your organization. You know, everything that happens, is happening through leaders from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top. And if there's any kind of clogs in there, just like you get a clog in your artery, it affects the organ, which in the heart of the organization would be all the leaders in there. That's how the executives get so much done with so many people and so few executives. I mean, that just makes sense. When you're going to, conflict management is a leadership skill, and but the problem is it is in fact communication. You can't have conflict with another person without communication. That's and so much of what I am providing in terms of skills, whether it's inspiring employees, handling difficult discussions, building trust, all these things that we're going to be talking about, they just don't happen without um, communication between two people, or one in a team, or one in many if you're talking to a major audience. So those are things that are important to understand. So why we spend so much time. If you just to kind of review what we covered in the first podcast, and if you haven't seen that first podcast, in there is a video explaining the dynamics of what happens when just two people, one on one, talk with each other. They having a discussion. And a lot of people use discussion and dialogue interchangeably just as a point of interest. They're two separate kinds of communication. Discussions are sharing of the information. Dialogue is designed to be a learning experience. It's specifically focused on a learning experience. So the deal here was, it's just if you think about organizations in general and the connection and the large number of people, you find all kinds of things happen because of interpersonal communication or the lack thereof. One of the things that I've found over 40 years is if you are, in fact, um, uh, spending any time in an organization, that organization might scale up. It may go from 10 employees to 100 employees to 1,000 employees. And where we find we have difficulties is we don't tend to enhance the communication or pay enough attention to communication when we scale up. And that's where I see a lot of the breakdown happening, is when companies scale up. They may start out, somebody has a great barbecue recipe, and they just open up a small, you know, 30-seat restaurant on Main Street in small town in one of the states in America. And that recipe is good, and more people keep coming. And the next thing you know, they're saying, hey, look, you know, it's getting the line's getting a little long. You know, we have to make reservations like 3 weeks in advance to get in here. Well, the owner begins to think, well, maybe I need to move this restaurant to a larger facility. And they do. And now they've got 150 and 200 seats, and they're doing shifts from lunch through dinner, and on into the evening till about 2 o'clock in the morning, where the club, the bar that they put in with the restaurant now is there. So people come in just for the bar sometimes to stay 2 in the morning. So now you have and now we're 100, maybe 100 employees uh, in that restaurant, and serving more people, obviously. And that catches on and fills up, and the line starts waiting again. So now what we're finding out is people are coming from the surrounding area, the other small towns in the area. And then sometimes they're coming maybe from a major metropolitan area like Chicago or Dallas or Detroit. And they're traveling 40 miles to come to this restaurant barbecue place. So the owner is approached by a couple of people who are uh, investors, and they're saying, we think we'd like to loan you some money so you can expand, because this looks like a good deal. Next thing you know, this owner now has 6 restaurants in varying small towns, and one in downtown, whatever metropolitan area it is. And so now that person can't be engaged in the restaurant anymore. They're now managing 6 restaurants with a staff of about maybe 21 to 40 cadre of supervisors and leaders, or managers, if you will, and maybe a staff of 400 or 500 employees now. This person was doing great when he opened up that small restaurant. People knew him. They spent time talking. I'm sure many of them were his friends. They probably go to church together. Now, um, he doesn't know a lot of the employees that are employed for him. So this whole concept is nobody taught him what was going on when two people talk to each other. All the kinds of things that go wrong. That's the stuff we covered last podcast. I encourage you to go back and watch that podcast a couple of times all the way through. Question I wanted to start with uh, this podcast. I had an interesting question. And if you're out there, I'll ask it, and I'll wait and see if any pops up on the chat box. But the question is, what's the best way to cope with conflict in an organization? So if you were out there answering that question, what would you tell me? What is the best way to cope with conflict in organization? Another way to ask it is, what is the best way to minimize conflict in organizations? Because the reality is, like I said, happens probably uh, less with that mom and pop on Main Street than it does with the guy who ended up building 6 restaurants, and actually may have started a whole chain of 35 to 40 restaurants across southeastern or midwestern or western part of the United States. Uh, then it gets a little more interesting about how you communicate and what barriers can get in the way. So we talked about all the barriers, the internal and external barriers that can get in the way when you're communicating last time. So what you can see with these courses that I've done is each course you take, the next one is going to be building on the first one. It's going to take information from the first one and enhance your now capability to do something different with all the information you learned from last week's podcast. You can now take that and start asking this, because if you knew what happens, what are the things that get in the way of communication, what are the barriers, what kinds of things we were talking about in that first podcast, you would take that and be thinking, okay, what kind of things get in the way of communication that would cause some sort of conflict? So, what what would we do? What would be the best way to minimize conflict in organizations or cope with conflicts in organization? What is this? So if you're out there and you got an idea, throw it up on the screen. Okay, so I don't see anybody doing anything here. So I'm gonna sort of follow through with what I would discuss if you were here. If somebody answered that question and they were saying, well, it'd be learn how to deal with corporations, I would say that's probably a pretty good answer. How learning how to do that, how to, and then I would say, well, how what are you learning? What are the key things that you think you need to do if you have conflict in your organization all of a sudden? And so people would probably come up with a variety of things. Uh, you know, you need to actively listen. Really, tell me more about that would be my response. And then we would find out, well, you need to pay attention what the person is saying. And, you need to be in an environment that doesn't seem to be threatening, and yet add some privacy so you can talk to them. And going, well, how do you do that when two people are in the break room yelling at each other? See, so those are the questions I want to ask if people will join me. I'm not going to respond to them, and I'm not going to answer them here if nobody comes and shows them, because I don't know that you would take, if I'm talking to you and I hear you responding, that allows me to know that you're grasping what I'm saying. Right now, I have no way of knowing what you would do, but simply taking anything I say and say, okay, I'll try that. It may not work, and it may not work for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is you may not understand the context, and you haven't had a chance to think through and discuss with me what I mean by, we need to have some sense of empathy. Why do we need to have that? Why do we need to have that empathy? And you may sense so something we would be talking through this, and you might come up with, well, it tends to calm the person down a little bit, and well, I say, what do you do to try to get people to go in that direction? And the person might say, Yeah, I don't know, please be quiet or something like that, or yelling doesn't help. And I'm going, no, that's not going to get them calmed down. What you have to do is get the conflict off of being focused on them. Their perception needs to be, and your points of communication need to take them to perceive that we need to be talking about whatever it is underpinning the anger you're seeing. You need to de-escalate the anger, and you can't do that by talking about the person. You have to move their discussion through the right questioning over to the point about the subject that caused the problem in the first place. Um, so, those are the kinds of things that we are discussing or will be discussing in the interpersonal communication course. That course is limited to 6 people. So I am on there, and then we have a screen that pops up that shows 6 people on that screen. It's like sitting around the table. The 7 of us are going to be sitting around that table talking about this idea of how to calm somebody down. How do you do that? So they're really angry. They're hopped up. They've reached a point where they're screaming superlatives of each other. They're yelling bad words that are judgmental and offensive, and you have to understand what's going on in their mind. There's a part of their brain that has kicked them off, that is something that's there actually to protect us. It's the amygdala. And most people's sense of that is the fight, flight, fear, or freeze kind of part of your brain. You either quickly make a decision to run, stay and fight, freeze in your tracks. And your amygdala bases this on the brain's past behavior. So it's one of the things that I tell people when they were in protection classes that I used to teach, personal protection classes with firearms. Well over 15, well, back in 2005 or 7. And I had when I first came out, I retired from business and consulting in general. I didn't really retire from consulting altogether, but generally speaking, I was out of the business, and then I would help people who knew me, and I was referred to them. But I started a little project of investigating violence because I found it interesting. It comes from my special forces days and my fascination with law enforcement and those things. I thought that might be a career for me after I came out of the service. It just didn't work out that way. But so I spent like 10 years investigating violence and the best way to protect against violence. I have 2 books out on Amazon about it called Creating a Bad Guy Free Zone. So uh, the idea here is uh, how you get somebody. I I saw conflict differently. I saw it when you're in the military and you're going through a training segment about how to fire weapons and how to enter buildings and how to clear rooms and those kinds of things. You're learning sort of an assertive approach to those things. Now, if you want to really, if you really want to protect yourself, that's actually highly proactive. If you want to learn how to shoot a gun correctly, clear a room, be able to ensure you don't have any lethal targets behind where you're shooting in case you miss. Um, Things like that are all things you have to think about when you actually, go in and sort of, you have burglars in your house and you're trying to deal with your burglars. If you fire at them, is that round going to go through the bedroom wall on the other side of the living room, through that wall into a bedroom where the children are? You know, have you thought about that before you fire? And what I'm trying to say is the amygdala is one of those things that kind of kicks that in. And you kind of have to train yourself uh, to adjust for that, to stop that from happening so that you can assess everything that's going on, to stay calm during all of this and not simply react quickly because that's what your amygdala is generating in your mind to do. It instinctively says, hey, it's like somebody told me about, I think a psychiatrist I was talking to. He says, you walk through the woods a lot and there's sticks and everything. But if you stepped on a stick and you felt a wiggle underneath you automatically sense snake. I mean, that's the history. That's what you associate with something long and narrow that wiggles is on the ground in the woods. You think snake. So you jump off of it immediately because you don't want to get bitten by a snake. The same way if you have a fire. I mean, what we found in our training courses is people had no sense of that. They had no ability. They weren't trained to control and shut that down before they made their decisions. And with the laser pointed gun, the exercises we did with law enforcement officers doing those exercises with us, uh, uh, the average citizen had no idea what they would do if they got put into a situation. They had to make a split-second decision. They walk into the bedroom and this person's got their child in their arms with a firearm to their head, and they have to decide, and they have a gun in their hand. They have to decide what they're going to do. You see that on TV all the time in the shows. And of course, the law enforcement makes the perfect shot every time. Well, I'm telling you, under those kinds of pressures, you're going to hit your target 3 out of 10 times, not 9 out of 10 times. I don't care how many times you do it at the range. That's what research and statistics says. So you have to make that decision, and they just couldn't do it. So in a conflict situation, okay, take us back to conflict here. If you walk into the break room, kind of like the thumbnail for this course is, and you see two employees going at it, yelling and screaming, and fingers are pointing at faces. They're this far from getting violent. You have a decision to make. Your inclination is to get between them and stop the violence by getting between them. But you could easily escalate that violence by stepping in between them for some reason. Or you could get hurt in that process. So there's a whole bunch of things we have to think about when it comes to conflict. What is conflict? What are the types of conflicts? That's the next question that I would be asking anybody who was watching this thing, who's obviously not watching it. Or for some reason, my maybe my comments aren't working. Let me take a look real quick and see. I am going to do a quick message here. And this will tell me, I know I'm live. So if I hit this comment, there it is. Yeah. So we're live. So there's nobody watching. So I can tell nobody's watching. If you do happen to come in here and you do have a question about uh, what to do in certain situations when conflict is escalated, so to speak, we can talk about that. But if you put a question up, please put a Q colon in front of your question, then ask the question, because I can actually search questions later and we can come back to them and take out the comments and the stuff that people put in during chats that aren't really gonna get us to answering the questions we need to answer. So if you have a question about conflict and leadership and communications role in that, then put a Q in front of that question. But back to our conflict situation. Yes, you have to de-escalate that thing. But the best way to do it is these people know that you have some sense of authority, or even if you don't have authority, you need to come across that way, but you need to do it not in a yelling, high pitched kind of way. You need to be the calming voice. You need to say, we need to stop this right now. Mary, you go to your office. John, you go to my office. I'll be in just a minute, and let's talk about what's going on here, okay? And they stop and they go to their offices. Now, what you've done there, you've interrupted the brain signal, okay? Because they were into this hot and heavy, and their brain was feeding them, saying, "You need to be defending. You need to be defending. You need to be judging this person. You need to be defending your point of view. Something's at stake here, and you need to make sure you're not harmed by it." That's what your brain is telling you. And it's instinctively telling you that, because that's how we know not to put our hand on a stove if it's hot. If you do that the first time, you remember the next time to check the stove before you put your hand on it. But even later, we try to figure out how to work around that, and we still get burned. See, but we'll remember those experiences when they happen. And the amygdala has taken that and folds it in. Now, it kind of gets a bad rap as part of the brain, because it also does that for the positive stuff too. Okay, so if there's something really positive that is consistently happening when you do something, it's kind of like they use this repetition to train athletes to make basketball shots, or to make the correct passes down the field. Um, somebody says go 5 yards out, cut left, and somehow the quarterback has to know that instinctively when to release that ball, so that that person that cut left is going to be at that point where the ball is within X seconds after he cuts left. The quarterback has to know that. He isn't counting 1001, 1002, 1003. It's kind of difficult to do when you have, 6 or 7 huge guys running down upon you. So they practice that over and over and over. And so when he gets the ball, he simply senses when he's supposed to release it based on those repetitive tasks. His mind has that locked in. And when he throws the ball, most of the time it hits the target. So when you're in the middle of an argument, the dilemma is you're into what's called a judging range, or a defensive posture in your mind. And you need to be there because you need to have that. And I don't know that you need to be there, but you need to have that part of your brain that works for you when you need it to work, because that is what could defend you from someone who's attacking you, or something that's bad that's really going to happen. It's kind of why I was telling you about the self-defense stuff. Your mind is designed to be that way. It's an important function for you to have. The dilemma is when you're staying there when you shouldn't be. When you're not getting anything out of that. You're there and you're screaming some really bad things at each other, and it's really not solving anything, because you're focused on that person and not the issue that needs to change. Now, maybe it is that person who needs to change, but it's what they need to change that you need to be focusing on. And they're taking it personally, like you're focusing on that woman. You're saying she's a woman and, she doesn't have the education you do, or whatever that might be, whatever those barriers to communication are. She can't grasp you yelling at her, take puts her in that same defensive mode. So you got those two judgmental brains just banging against each other. None of them are getting to the real core problem. So that's when friend or manager or somebody steps in and says, "Stop it," and literally you have to do that. You have to stop in and be assertive in your command. Stop this. This isn't helping anybody. You go somewhere else and you go over there. And I don't care if you have the authority to make them do that or not. Most of the time, people will stop it. If you're forceful enough, they will stop it. You don't even have to get in between them. You can tell them this, and they will stop thinking. And when they stop thinking that way, you shut down that part of the brain that's reacting and pouring fuel on the fire. It stops. And it opens up a part of the brain that says, okay, this I really probably didn't mean to go this far on this. I didn't. I need to back up a minute. And it normally stops both people thinking that way. Now that doesn't happen 100% of the time, and sometimes you have to call the police and break them up, handcuff them, and all that kind of stuff. But most of the time, it works. Because most people are rational. Most people don't want to be in conflict. So that's a dynamic. So what is it about the communication, the forcefulness of that communication? Uh, and could you do that if you were in a discussion like we are tonight and you had six people sitting in different places around the country on a screen and they got into an argument? Would you be as effective if you weren't physically there? There's something about proximity, that how close I am to you, that impacts your nonverbal feelings. There's something that you sense when I'm close to you that you won't sense if I'm sitting on a screen like I am now. So these are some of the things about communication that, if you go back and understand, if we get into a deep discussion, and we didn't do that in the first podcast, you're not going to get that in the first podcast because that wasn't the principle. But the idea is, if you understand how the system works and you take time to talk about it, to learn, and to replicate how you deal with something like that. And the more you replicate it, the better you become at it, the more second nature it becomes, the easier it is for you to apply something that will, in fact, stop somebody. And you set them down and you say, okay, let's talk about what in the world is this argument about? Well, no. I'm not knowing. I can see where she is, and I know her. She's my employee. I want to know, what were you arguing about? So please tell me that, if you don't mind. And they're stopping at that point, because all of a sudden they can't be engaged in demeaning the person. They have to think about what they're demeaning the person for. That's the subject of the conflict, not her. Not, even if it's how she did it, what she did. The fact is, something about what she did made it uncomfortable, or did something to shine this other person in a negative light. These are the things that you have to do. You have to start talking to people and start working with them as individuals and get them down to the core issues, uh, the things that started the conflict this, to begin with. Because what probably happened is it didn't start with them demeaning each other. It got to that point as the communication progressed. Yeah, also have a neurological disorder as that's hereditary, and as you get older, it gets worse. Uh, uh, Seems like I'm just physically a wreck tonight, but but these are the things that you want to understand well enough and discuss well enough, which we do in the course, for you to be able to grasp it and then be able to go out and sort of apply them and see when they work and when they don't, and under what circumstances, and what you need to adjust to make them work better, and eliminate those things that you do that make them not work as well. And so you learn some things. You learn to that if you can calm them down, if you don't raise your voice, if you're talking to them on calm, even a more mellow FM radio person voice, that helps calm people. There's research in neuroscience to show the that more lower pitched, lower frequency voice has a more bass oriented voice, a lower tone, if you will, has a more calming effect on neurons in the brain that will cause the excitement that causes excitement to calm down. So they've done some research from an auditory perspective on the brain that shows us. So if you're going in with a high pitch and you're saying, "You guys better shut up, and if I'll send you to your rooms if you can't get it, I will." If you're adding to the, if you're trying to stop the conflict, and you're adding to it by your tone of voice and what you're saying, then excuse me, then that escalates things, and you need to de-escalate. That's the first thing you do, de-escalate. Now, the fast way to do that is to go in and say, stop it. Just stop it. You guys don't need to be doing this in front of everybody else. They don't deserve to hear it. Whatever that takes to stop it, send them to their rooms. Then when you can go talk to them, you can take a more empathetic approach to them, and you can begin to get what's going on behind that issue. That's what you're going to have to do to resolve the conflict. You can manage the conflict by stopping it and de-escalating it. And if they both calm down and go back to the office and start going to work, and you think you've finished, you're sadly mistaken, because that's going to pop up again. You need to resolve it after you manage it. And to resolve it takes a little more effort by understanding where that person's coming from, working them through whether they're right or wrong about that. It could be that they were right. This guy was right about that woman, and what she's doing is wrong. And yes, it's antagonizing. But then you need to say, look, she does a pretty good job. If this is an issue, let's work on helping her overcome it. What do you say? Okay, I see that. That's what you're trying to get to in these areas. So the question is, what's the best way to cope with conflict? Actually, the best way to cope with conflict is not to be able to effectively de-escalate it and resolve it through using empathy and everything. The best way is not to have conflict at all. just like I was saying about protection. The best thing about protection is not a bigger gun, is not having mace, is not having anything. Frankly, if you're at that phase in a self-defense scenario, you're already in a fight. You're in a win. If you go take self-defense courses, you're assuming you're going to be in a fight. Or if you buy a gun, you're assuming you're going to be in a gunfight. All of those things are lose-lose scenarios. You could get shot, they could get shot. If you shoot them, they don't shoot you. If you didn't do it the right way, you could go to jail for the rest of your life. If you did do it the right way, you still have to live with the consequences of taking a life, which does weigh on your mind. So same thing here with the conflict situation. Just because you happen to be right in a conflict situation doesn't mean you handled it the right way. And that's what you need to impress on somebody. Just because it's right doesn't mean you need to do it the right. You could be doing something that is righteous, so to speak, and it's not contributing to the benefit or welfare of another person or the group as a whole. You'd still be right, but most people are not going to look at somebody and say, hey, they're right. It's like you have a right to shoot somebody who comes in your house. That doesn't make it the right thing to do. Uh, you have a judgment call there. And so, what you're trying to do with people who are engaged in conflict is not just manage the conflict, not just de escalate it. The resolution is to help them understand what was wrong about their approach to handling that way, to getting into an argument in a break room with another employee. Well, that isn't. I mean, you might be right about the argument, but what you did and how you handle it doesn't make it right the way you did it. So conflict is the best way to handle conflict is in the hiring process. Excuse me. It's in the hiring process. It's to hire someone who fits in, who kind of fits in with the whole group. I know I had a team. I think there were 15 of us. And I learned early on when I was recruiting, when I first started in business, I worked for an IT firm, and the guy that had the IT firm, he had a process for hiring I thought was pretty good. He said, I want the recruiter to go out and identify the personality, whether this person seems to have the knowledge base, but do they also have the characteristics that we like, that we want to fit into the organization. And then, if they did, the next part of the interview process was to send them to that place that they were going to apply, that they were applying for, that they were going to send them to work there, and have every employee talk to them. Did a couple of things. It let that person know what it was like to work there, because they were actually talking to the people that they would be working with. So they could ask the questions about how treatment happened and all this kind of stuff. And so It was a long interview process. I mean, it took hours to complete on a regular basis. Uh, but the turnover rate in this company was almost non existent. Once you were in there, you liked where you were working so much that it took something like a lot more money or an opportunity that was far beyond what that company had to offer at the time for someone to say, "Yeah, I need to leave." Uh, but it was so enjoyable to work there. It was so enjoyable that the people that you work with, the boss, everybody was on the same page. Everybody seemed to have that kind of value system to fit. Now, did everybody that I sent into those interviews get hired? No, it's probably about an 80 to 90 percentile rate. Um, but maybe something I missed something during the interview that they picked up on. But there were like three layers. There was me. Then they went to like a sort of like a director of the area, and then they then referred that person to meet with the manager and the employees of that area. And then they got together and had a team session to decide how they felt and shared that with the district manager. Because at that point in time, the district manager was probably saying, I don't need to make this decision. These people make the decision for me. That's how well they work together. And I don't remember a lot of conflict or toxicity in the culture in this company. You could go to any office at any point in time and you got the same kind of good vibes, comfortable vibes. Um, so there wasn't a lot of conflict. So one of the best ways to cope with conflict is the hiring process. Make sure the person you hire fits into your organization, and you're most likely going to have someone who comes in and feels valued because they're learning, they're growing. Everybody puts their arms around them and mentors them up the ladder. Uh, and they then kind of take that on to the next organization. So that's probably one of the best ways to do that. The next way is to create a transparent and open communication process. The biggest problem, I remember I told you I did some assessments, and the biggest complaint we got about communication of leaders communication, the number one thing they want them to improve, probably out of that, the number one thing that they needed to improve, and probably if they did this one thing they would solve 65% of their communication problem, was frequency of interaction. uh, there wasn't a lot of interaction between leaders and the employees, physical face to face sit down, come in, and some of it you I don't know if you've ever had one of these leaders. Somehow they were always walking the floor. We hear you need to walk the floor, but these people, it's not just walking the floor, not just being physically visible, but that sense that you know you you could see this person, you can see these people walking through, and when they come upon somebody, they might say, "How's your mom doing? I understand she's out of the hospital now." Bang. Yeah. An employee hears that and they go, "Well, you know what? I'm still struggling. It's hard to find somebody to be with her certain times. So why don't we look at your schedule, see if we can help you out? Maybe you could do some of this from home until you get back." that's all it takes. That person's they're there for life. You're gonna have to pry them off the wall to get them out of there. It's that kind, and it's not just he's talking about changing the schedule. He's talking about changing the schedule because he cares about you and he understands how difficult it is for you and how much you care for your mother, for example. Those kinds of things are things that keep conflict down. It's the transparency of the communication. It's their ability to know and sense both from the employee's demeanor, their nonverbal behavior, the discussions that they have on an ongoing basis, talking with everybody in that office, and the frequency of that. They can basically take the pulse, if you will, of the department and have a feeling of where the issues are. You can almost sense the friction between people when you don't see them talking to each other. One of the things I think people sense that being back in the office might solve is that idea of getting around the water cooler and getting to know each other and talking. Now, we know that's not true because we know from the pandemic how much failure we had in that kind of communication process. But I also know we didn't train people in this stuff we're talking about right now, interpersonal communication. So those are some of the dynamics of what I'm trying to say to you. If we can have these kinds of discussion, now I'm I'm telling you my stories, stuff that I've seen happen in environments I've been in and that I've worked in, and stories that work out. The guy I'm telling you about is actually a manager that I worked with in an organization, happened to be an insurance company, um, big one. He was the one most people, if he had a position open, it wasn't open very long because people in that organization applied to go to work in his department. He was that kind of person. They liked to be around him. And so he would take the time to train you and develop you and make you feel valued and important. And you wanted to be around him. You were starving for that kind of attention. Uh, so the problem is he never got to handle any new employees because everybody was transferring over. So one of the dilemmas we had to deal with, I had to convince. I think there were like 9 other people like him, and that's that area of the organization, all within fairly close proximity to each other. The rest of them didn't have that kind of an environment. And it took a while for me to convince them that if, it was kind of like follow along with me and let's just go follow along with him and just watch. Now, tell me what you saw. It was a self-learning experience if I could get them to follow me or if we could get into a situation. Um, they didn't like the idea that I was referring to him and as an example because that's a competitive mode. But sometimes you need to say, I'm not wanting you to look at him. I want you to look at his people while he's with them. Don't focus on him. Look at what his people are doing when he comes around. So when we're talking about conflict, one way to resolve it is to minimize it to start with, to have open and transparent communication, to spend time training your people about these concepts of not judging others, and how to shut down your mind if you start moving into a negative perspective, to ask for help. To ask for help. Some people never ask for help and they fall into a pit and they're having a hard time getting out. Then, when you want to help them, they're guilty about it. They're guilty for not asking. And they feel like they're a failure in that process. And it's almost like a psychological, it's like, group therapy works for a reason. It works for a reason. And if you can kind of create that environment in your organization, your conflicts are going to go down to nil. The other story I tell, so as I'm looking at these, and then we'll get off of conflict, because obviously nobody's going to jump on here and ask me any more questions that take us down deeper roads of things that you need to know. You can take the course, and yeah, you're going to walk out knowing some of this stuff real well. When I was doing that stint where I was looking at security and safety and relative to violence, um, one of the things I did is I took a position in uh, a bar, so to speak. It's not the most popular, not known for its safety. I was talking to its owner, and they were asking me, what is it we can do to take this stigma off of us so more people who have more money to spend will come in here. Uh, in other words, elevate its image a little bit. And so I took a stint with this person for 6 months as a security officer in the evenings on weekends. Uh, just observe. I handled the security. Certainly could be armed, but I wasn't going to carry a firearm in a nightclub. That's like asking for trouble. But one of the things that I was able to discern from a communication perspective is you can observe the nonverbal behavior of people and also their verbal language, the tone of and pitch of voice, and those kinds of things. And I was telling that manager, I would walk up to him and I'd say, person's over here, that there's going to be problem in that area over there. So why don't you go get the other guy and join me over there? And he goes, what are you talking about? I don't see anything over there. I said, yeah, this is going to escalate. So what's going on there? Because I could tell. Well, I had the training as a communications expert, but I could tell across the bar, just by gestures, just by movements, just by facial features and various nonverbal cues, this person was escalating into hostility. They were trying to pick a fight, in other words. They were doing it in a non-threatening way initially, but you could see it escalating through the various nonverbal behaviors, the people that they were talking to, who they chose to talk to. Very attractive women whose husbands were right next to them. Uh, and, those kinds of things. You could almost see it brewing. When we got over there and just kind of were standing in that area just observing for a little bit, the manager said, oh my gosh, this is so clear. And so what we did is we took the guy over and said, look, we want you to come over and try a couple of these drinks we're working on. So come join us over here, and I want you to try these drinks. And he'd make up, I don't know, one of the more exotic drinks that he didn't normally serve in the bar. And the guy got to talking with us and working through it. And we just said, hey, look, I can kind of tell you had about one too many. And the guy goes, yeah, I have. And he said, let me call you a cab. I'll pay for it, send you home. And he goes, sure, okay. And that ended that whole thing. Nothing ever happened in there. And we went from a somewhat frequent physical encounter bar to less frequent physical encounter bar over the next 6 months to virtually no problems at all in that bar. And that required changing some of the wait staff out that, uh, to make it a little more uncomfortable for a clientele of the badass kind of person. Didn't feel as comfortable in there after that. Prices went up a little bit on the drinks. That was one thing. Uh, so we changed some of the decor that made it less attractive for those people who uh, really enjoy the idea that maybe they would get in some sort of altercation and their manliness could be proven there. All of that was part of a communication and behavior approach that changed the image and literally reduced the conflict in that bar and had nothing to do with throwing people in jail or arresting them or handcuffing them or physically manhandling them out of the bar, grabbing them by the back and throw them out of the bar, kind of like you see in the westerns. Um, Nothing like that. It was very subtle. It was a very subtle communication change. The signal that was being sent by the image of the lounge stopped being a bar. It started being a lounge, and all kinds of things like that make a difference and can impact. If you become astutely aware of how people look, what kinds of communication you have that are, what's the, a lot of times I'll go in and I say, if you have conflict here, what are the types of conflict you have? Are they personal things where people are mad at each other? Are they things around resources? Like one company I worked with, the one of the big hot conflict scenarios that got directors mad at each other, and they, they didn't really bond as well as they should be bonding to move the company forward. It was conflict over resources. Why is this person getting more money than me? I remember the one department person, the looked at the during this discussion about resources, and I had a discussion with this guy earlier. I said, "Do you need all this money you're getting? That's a lot of money." It was like everybody was fighting for 4 or 5% more every year. And this person wasn't in charge of one of those departments that was growing at a rapid rate. I mean, it was a pretty consistent department, but he was getting 3 or 4 or 5% increase every year. Um, I said, "Do you need all that money?" He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, seems like your marketing guy is struggling over there to get any kinds of funds in that'll help him. What do you think we ought to do? Is there anything you think you could do?" And he went back and looked at his budget. He came back the next morning. He walked into that budgeting meeting. The battle was on again. And the guy goes, look, um, I've got a few $1,000s here I really don't need. Why don't we take that and put it over into marketing? I thought everybody was going to fall out of their chair. It was like dead silence. And everybody was looking at him, especially the VP, the executive VP was looking at him going, are, are you nuts? What is this? And he goes, yeah, I mean, every year I'm under budget every year. And I think we can do it, and I can do everything I need to do, and I don't need this amount of money to do it. I could probably give this money back to you, and then maybe. But I think a good place is to put it over here with the marketing guy. I thought that guy was just almost in tears. He was looking at him like, really? That started a whole discussion about culture amongst that team, and what they were reflecting to their employees when they went back after these sessions, these conflict sessions over resources. So these are the things we talk about in the class, just this class on this. So I'm not going to go any further than that. You can get a taste of that from what I've said. Uh, there's a lot more to learning about these skill sets and how you can use communication a lot more effective if you understand it, if you understand the dynamics of how to use nonverbal behavior, how to sense the incongruity or the congruity between nonverbal behavior and the actual words and language used, the tone, the pitch. Sometimes, for example, you're going to find out when I talk about the nonverbal side. There are 4 or 5 things in nonverbal communication. 3 or 4 of them people probably don't know. One is kinesics. That's the face features, and hey, there's a gesture. Thumbs up. Thumbs. Wait, where's my camera? There it is. Thumbs up. Okay, that means it's okay. Yeah, unless you happen to be in some countries. Some countries that could be a very bad thing to do. I don't know that it is, but you have to be careful about gestures. But and it's built on culture, and we talked about culture in the last session. You know what culture is if you watch that session, starting with the core value system out to the belief system, the expectations, and uh, those sort of expectations, etc. Those sort of things are, we discuss, play a role. They help you assess or sense, and they also help you sense what's going on. And should you spend some time deciding to um, decide whether or not things are okay or not, how do you know when to assess to ensure that you're consistently going on the right things? So uh, a lot to be learned. Now, we talked about uh, what interpersonal communication was, that it is a closed system and a process, and it's integrated. You don't want to just learn active learning or feedback or nonverbal communication. You want to learn how those all interact with each other, how they're all interdependent upon each other, to have a total connection system that allows you to draw meaning through active, ongoing dialogue with each other or discussions with each other, to you come to some agreed upon meaning of what you're trying to say that we all can agree on. Those kinds of discussions, if they can be held in the open, transparent, like we're talking about here, it also lets you know the kind of communication you need to step in and stop an ongoing, out of control, so to speak. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Out of control uh, conflict. You gotta stop it. You gotta stop it in its tracks, de-escalate it by separating, and then you, with your calmness, have to come in and be able to start resolving that. We talk about how to do that, and a little more about how to apply the various communication techniques to make that happen. If you, my guess is you haven't had any training A lot of that. Some of this has to do with the neuroscience, like I was telling you, the idea that now we have science telling us that what we've kind of known to be right. Like you want to go in with a more calm, uh, more of a deeper voice when you're trying to talk with folks and say, I understand that you're showing a lot of hostility and you must really be upset. And tell me what's behind that. Well, da 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 da. Well, what was that all about? I know she was upset also, but what was it about? Tell me more about that. And you do that in a calm, baritone voice, very low voice. Uh, that person will begin to calm down. They'll begin to start focusing on the problem and not the person. And, it could be, for example, that they're arguing about something she did wrong that affected him really bad. The problem is she may not have known what to do. And maybe that's because she was never trained to what to do. And we won't know that until we talk to her, will we? So that's your next step. You've got to go find out what the other person said. Same way, calm, collective process. Then you have to kind of consolidate some of that. And then you can bring them both together and say, okay, now here's kind of what I discovered. You guys tell me if I'm wrong or not, but here's how I see it. How do you guys see this now that you have this information that you didn't have? You didn't know she hadn't been trained how to do that, did you? No, I didn't. I just expect because she's in a position she's supposed to know. Well, there's some things you may not know in some of your positions totally yet. But even if you do, that's great. But is your expectation that everybody should know that? And why would you have that expectation? Why wouldn't we be more concerned about how we can train people? I think that might be something we can approach. Do you kind of agree we could work on that together? So, those are the things that you look at and that you work through and you learn through courses about communication that help you better apply the leadership skill of conflict management and resolution. And I had to spend a lot of time just talking to leaders about the communication aspect about these areas. But before I could get them to the empathy phase, some of these people never even had, some of these people had backgrounds that empathy was not part of their life for most of their life. I know I'm that way. I came from a broken home. I Empathy is not something that comes natural to me. It just isn't. Um, it's why I seek to have a rationalization to everything and just not an emotional solution. That's who I am. And I know it's a issue. I have to watch myself. And occasionally I screw up. And the closer you are to people, the more likely you are to screw up. But if you can admit that and say, you know, I just I know what I said or did is wrong, and I shouldn't have said it. That's who I am right now. I'm trying to work through it. You'd be surprised that people might want to help you work through it. All right, we're going to let you go. Uh, I didn't get a chance for anybody to come up. I hope in the future I'm going to put these in to podcast, and I'm going to go through all 12 programs pretty much like this, just taking a piece and showing you how important interpersonal communication is to that particular skill set of leadership. So you just get a feeling. There's so much more that comes out when you have five other people in a session talking about what they saw at work today, or what they did at work today, or what they did at home, or wherever they're getting their data from the assignments we give them. They have assignments. They go look and they see, to share these things: what works, what didn't work, why it didn't work. Then we can apply it to, oh well, we can see where this was missing as part of the communication. Maybe this barrier was in the way, we didn't know how to remove it. How do you remove those kind of barriers? How do you tell your boss? I think you would probably shock your boss if you just went in tomorrow and arbitrarily sat down with them and said, "Look, how am I doing?" Yeah. Uh, that would be a shock if they're not used to that. If they're not feeling that connection close enough to you for you to make that request. And certainly they may not be ready to tell you because they don't have the information or whatever. Uh, but that's sad, because that means they're not spending the time, the frequency. They're not talking enough about your work. They're not talking enough about you. The interaction isn't transparent. It doesn't appear to be real or genuine or authentic to you. All of these kinds of things come from how well you connect through interpersonal communication to the other person. And so that's what we talk about. Hopefully, if you'd like to take these courses, it has to, you're going to have to decide if the value is right for you on that. Okay. Uh, I will see you next week at this time. Hopefully, my cold. I apologize very much by my cold, but I don't want to get behind on these. I don't want to get behind. They're weekly, and I just have to fight through the coughing and the nasal infection and congestion that goes with all that. And I apologize for it being annoying. Hope you took something out of this. Please spread the word around. I'd really love to get some people in here. I don't care if it's 4 or 5 people. In fact, if you get many more than that and it starts scrolling, it becomes difficult. I'd really love the idea of having 5 or 6 people who get over and chat, and then we could bring them over and maybe have all of us in a roundtable discussion, so to speak, on the air, talking about this. I mean, I'd love to hear your opinions about the kinds of things you deal with in your conflict and how you cope with it. And uh, there's probably some things I've missed that you'll bring in, and then that's the idea, that people get to hear a whole bunch of things. All right, I will see you next week. Until then, you be safe. Have a great holiday. Have a great holiday. Be thankful. Be grateful.